Last week we studied Genesis chapter 15 from verse 8 to the end. And in this passage of chapter 15, Jesus was having a conversation with his friend Abram. Then he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it." And he said, "Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it?" So Abram says, "How can I know that this is true, what you're promising me?" He wants a sign. Verses 9 through 11. So he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two down the middle and placed each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So the question I asked is, how is God supposed to explain the future to you? You ask for proof. How can he prove the future? The first 3 times God spoke to Abram, God made promises. But promises, are often broken. So the Son of God now stoops to make promises even stronger using the ancient covenant. The way you made a covenant in the Old Testament was for 2 parties to cut animals in half long ways. Then you set the halves on opposite sides, and each person walks between them, so you get blood all over your feet. And it signifies that if either of you fails to keep your part of the bargain, you must die cut in half. Well, Abram obeys and cuts the animals in half as God told him. But then he waits and waits and waits, and vultures show up. And Abram shoos them away. Abram's waiting for God to come and walk through the halves with him. Now verses 12 through 16. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. And behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they will come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So Abram falls asleep, but it is not a nice sleep. It's not a relaxing sleep. We're told that great darkness and horror fell upon him in his sleep. But God spoke to him while he was asleep and first gave him the bad news and then the good news. The bad news was that Abram's descendants are going to be slaves in a foreign land for 4 centuries. And then God will make those enslavers pay dearly for that long slavery. That would be Egypt. They're not mentioned by name, though. But then God returns with the good news, at least for Abraham. He will die peacefully at a good old age. He won't be a slave, and he's not going to die in battle. So Abram has no reason to fear the future. Now Genesis 15:16, the last verse. Well, no, not quite the last verse, but in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. During the centuries while the Jews are slaves in Egypt, the Amorites who live in Canaan will become more and more wicked. And God intends to destroy the Canaanites to give all of that land to Israel. It's just like Sodom and Gomorrah. The Amorites were utterly wicked, and God wanted them exterminated. That was the righteous judgment of God to be carried out by his own people at God's direct orders. Now we have God's words telling Joshua and Moses and all the other people to exterminate the Canaanites. However, we must never take that idea of exterminating the wicked Amorites as proof that modern Christians can go and exterminate the wicked. That would be a terrible misapplication of the Bible. That kind of error justified the Crusades during the Middle Ages, and the Crusades were neither Christian nor righteous. Some people have blamed Christianity, though, for the extermination of Native American Indians, and that is wrong. The weepy liberal lie that we always hear told today is that armies of evil patriarchal European white men marched like ants over the continent and slaughtered all the peaceful nature-worshiping natives. That's nonsense. It's a lie. The truth is that 80 to 90% of the Native Americans died of diseases long before we ever tried to kill any of them, just because they were not immune to our European diseases. The next biggest death toll to the natives came from their own doing because the French paid them, perhaps tricking them, to attack the British colonies. And in response, the British colonies wiped out a lot of the Indians during a war. That was not slaughtering innocent people. So the French and Indian Wars caused huge native losses. It was only during the last decades of the 19th century, when colonists annihilated the American bison, that destroyed the main food supply for the Native Americans in the West and the central U.S. And so it was never a Christian extermination of anyone. It happened in stages, and it was not the Christians' fault. They were evils. There were wicked white massacres of Native Americans, but it was never a Christian-promoted goal. There was probably very few, if any, pastors thundering from the pulpit, "Kill those Indians. Go do your righteous will of God." I've never heard of such a thing. It may have occurred, but it was certainly not mainstream. It was the advance of secularism and capitalism. It was wanting to steal their land and the resources that caused the death of the Indians. It didn't have anything to do with religion. Now, I'm not saying we can make a specific application. In fact, I'm saying we cannot make a specific application of the destruction of the Amorites. God said specifically that the Amorites had filled up the measure of their sins. That's the direct will of God, but God has never since told us to annihilate anyone. And so we should not do so. Finally, the last few verses of Genesis 15, verses 17 through 21. "And it came to pass, when the sun went down, and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river," etc., etc., and then he lists a bunch of peoples that are going to be conquered. The most important thing about these verses, though, is the appearance of God. God decides to walk alone between the animal pieces. Abraham does not walk through them. He can't keep the covenant even if he wants to. Jesus has to keep the covenant on his behalf, or he must die. Also notice that God does not walk like a man does. This is not a Christophany. It's not a bodily appearance of Jesus. Abram sees a burning furnace and a flaming torch pass between the halves. The smoking oven in Hebrew is a small portable oven. It was fairly small, very hot, and it had smoke coming out of it. And it's apparently levitating through the air, not dragging on the ground. And then behind it comes the flaming torch. It's either a fiery lighted torch or perhaps a torch with lightning coming out of it. The torch is flickering with periods of brightness in flashes. In other words, it's not a steady, constant light. It flickers. We're told in verse 18 that Jehovah, that's Yahweh, made this covenant. So this is the Son of God, the covenant God, the personal God. This is God's friend appearing as a smoking oven and a flaming torch. So what do those symbolic appearances mean? This is often how God the Son will appear to his people throughout the books of Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, as smoke and as flame. The Son appears to Moses in the burning bush that apparently smoked and flamed but was never consumed. The burning bush kept burning. And then, as the people of Israel wandered through the desert, they had a smoky cloud by day and a flaming cloud by night. So it is possible that the oven represents the trials and hardships of God's people over 400 years in captivity. They will be in great distress for a long time. However, God's flame is following them, and they will successfully reach the other side. So the trials will purify them and bring God's people to the land as he promised. The Son will not abandon them in their trials and their miseries. He will send helpers like Moses and Aaron, but it's he himself who will carry the people out of Egypt. So I think that the Son of God is saying to Abram, there are a lot of hard times coming for your descendants, but I will be the one shaping them. The centuries of oppression will not destroy them. I will be there and I will lead them through this covenant even though they're not capable of it. It's my power and light that will make these covenant promises work. So that's the end of the review, and today we start Genesis chapter 16. A whole new story, and unfortunately a evil story in many ways. Genesis 16, we'll start with verses 1 and 2. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children through her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. So Abram, he believed God. We were told that back in chapter 15. But now, a few years later, Sarah is cracking. It was a serious shame on a woman in the ancient world to have no sons and no children. The family unit would cease to exist. Abram's name would die with him. So Sarai starts scheming. Now, of course, scheming is a loaded word, but it's not unwarranted here. God promised that Abram would have lots of descendants from his own body. So Sarah says to herself, well, he didn't say anything about my body. Maybe it's not going to come from my body. So I've got to find a substitute. But I still want Abram to be my husband, and it will be my child. So she schemes. She blames God. God has restrained me from having children. So that's the first thing she says that's wrong. But she says to herself, maybe Abram can still get other women pregnant. Hey, Abe, I have this hot young Egyptian chick. Come and use her to get us some sons. Now, we can assume that Hagar was probably young and beautiful. We can't be sure, but generally, if you wanted a surrogate mother, you wouldn't pick the ugliest lady in the block. So I'm guessing she was attractive and healthy. And she was one of the false rewards, shall we say, given by the Pharaoh, just to get them out of Egypt, because he had lied. Abram had lied to him. So anyway, they have this lovely Egyptian girl, and Sarah decides this is the way to get God's promises fixed. So look at verse 3. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. Now, even though slavery was not supposed to be permanent, nor should it include the children born by slaves, it is customarily being done that way. God, in the book of Exodus, will stop that, or try to put a stop to it, but it had been going on. But Sarah thinks they can make an exception because the end justifies the means. We need a son. I can get a son out of this female slave. It's my right to do so. It was a common practice in ancient times. In Egypt, the Pharaoh had many wives and concubines. A concubine was kind of like a secondary wife. Not titled, but still available all the time to the man. But this happened throughout the Old Testament. Many Old Testament saints had multiple wives. But this case with Hagar is not exactly a wife. This is using a slave to have a child and claiming the child as your own heir. So Ishmael will belong to Abram and Sarah and not to his mother Hagar. Hagar might get treated better. She might even be freed from slavery, but Ishmael does not belong to her line anymore. If he has any kids, she's not their grandma. This is the first occurrence in the Bible of what we call surrogacy. To use liberal modern woke words, Hagar is just the birthing person. Hagar will have to nurse him and will help to raise him, but not be his mother per se. Now Sarah does say here to Abram, you can take Hagar as your wife, but the word is not as strong as normal wife. It's more of the word like concubine, which means less than wife. You can have her as a play wife, so to speak. And that's obviously how Sarai intends it, as a concubine, because she still owns Hagar. You know, if the wives were equal, Sarai wouldn't own her, but they're not equal. Sarai still owns her. So she's still a slave at best. Now, of course, modern feminist scholars all claim that this is rape. A slave forced to have children for her master is just another proof of African enslavement. And of course, they get that because she was an Egyptian. Now, it is possible that Hagar was black, or at least not white, but we aren't really sure how long it took before the African peoples became black due to the long time environment and the heavy sunshine. Don't really know. Maybe she was just somewhat darker. But as for the claim of rape, that is wrong. Although it is true that Hebrew has no word for rape, they just basically have word for sex. It's clear that whenever there's a case of rape in the Bible, they always make it clear that it was done wrongly, violently, by trickery or something. and there's no indication of that here. So there are many wrongs done here in this text, but violence probably isn't one of them. R. Kent Hughes points out that there's a huge ironic reversal in this story. Down in Egypt, trustless Abram gave Sarai over to the Egyptian Pharaoh. Now in Canaan, untrusting Sarai gives Abram over to her Egyptian servant. So people are just giving each other away for various reasons. Abram and Sarai are taking turns showing that they have brief flashes of faith, and then they royally mess up with their lack of faith. So they're just wavering back and forth. So now Genesis 16:4. So Abram went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Notice how little Abram uses his brain in this chapter. Almost never. Sarai comes up with an idea. Abram shrugs. Okay. Sarai gives him a pretty young slave. Abram sleeps with her, and he succeeds in getting her pregnant. Yippee! Well, not so yippee. Abram did not consult with God. He didn't think much about it at all, perhaps. He should have known that this was wrong if he knew anything about history. He must have known about the promise of God, that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And then he knew after Noah that Ham's line was cursed, but the line of Shem was blessed. The line of Shem would be the line that the Messiah would come from. So if he gets a child from Hagar, who is the line of Ham, it will not be the seed of the woman to crush the serpent. In other words, he's starting to look at his lineage. He's so blindly desirous to have a son, he doesn't even care if it's a son in the right line. He doesn't realize that it's the Messiah that will come from his line. Now, I'm not saying that it's always wrong to marry or have children with those from the line of Ham. Even if you're able to know these days who's from the line of Ham. I mean, it's not just color anymore. So what I'm saying, though, is that if you know you're in the line of the Messiah, as Abraham should, then he has to continue the line of the Messiah, then he can't have a child through the line of Ham. So this would have been, he should have known this was wrong. He's got to have it from the line of Shem, from which he and Sarai were. So even if he succeeds in having kids through Hagar, that line will not be the Messiah's line. He's not thinking about the right things. Maybe he's just curious. Maybe he's wondering all these years, he's 95 or 85 and Sarah's 10 years younger than him. Is it his fault? Maybe he's the one who's infertile, not her. Well, this would be a great way to find out, and Sarah even wants it. I mean, Sarah wants me to sleep with her, so what's wrong with it? Doesn't that make it right? Only in wife speak. The person who is supposed to be the authority and the wise one is the husband. But like Adam, Abram leaves Eve to her own schemes, and he ends up going along with her schemes and paying the price for it. And this is going to be creating immediate problems for the whole world and for his own family. The Hebrew words are even used in parallel with Genesis chapter 3. Abram and Sarai's mistake was almost identical to Adam and Eve's mistake. The words are in this order. Abram listened to his wife, just as Adam listened to his wife. Sarai took Hagar, just as Eve took the fruit. Same verbs in every case. Sarah gave Hagar to her husband. Eve gave the fruit to her husband. All three verbs are identical and in the same format. So they're trying to prove that Abram and Sarai are making the same mistake that Adam and Eve made. And in every case, the man enjoyed it, at least temporarily. For a month or two, perhaps, everything was calm and seemed fine, until Hagar started showing signs of pregnancy. The old saying, "Be careful what you wish for, you may get it," comes to mind again. Sarai and Abram thought that once Hagar gives them a child, they will have solved the long-term promise of God not helping. They hurried God along successfully. But there is this thing, it's probably a corollary of entropy, called the law of unintended consequences. The law of unintended consequences basically means that no human after the fall has been smart enough to anticipate all of the potential problems from any action. Even a good action can have negative consequences. Even bad actions can have good consequences. We're not smart enough to recognize what's going to come. It somehow never occurred to Sarai and Abram that wrongly using an Egyptian slave to bear their child would make Hagar snotty. And that's what it did. She has what they want badly, a child. And so now she figures she can ignore her old work and taunt her owner. Ha, there's nothing you can do to me. What are you going to do? Kill me? You kill the baby. So she figures now she is in the position of power. She has reversed her position as slave. She thinks she's a wife, a true wife, and that Abram, because he's going to get a boy from her, Abram will love her and get rid of Sarah. She's thinking she's going to be the new mistress of the house. Well, it's interesting. She seems to think that she can lay around the tent all day and eat bonbons. It's interesting, though, that the text says she then despised her mistress Sarah. So what Hagar is thinking is that now Sarah is the secondary wife and I will be the favored one. After all, I'm giving Abram what he needs. So Hagar is hoping now she can displace Sarah. But she really overplays her hand, so to speak. She apparently does not really understand the depth of love that Abram has for Sarah, even if he is crazy about getting a son. It appears that Abram is willing to give up his dream for a son to keep Sarah. So Hagar wrongly chose there. Now verses 5 and 6. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So Sarai talked Abram into this scheme, and now it's going badly. She blames him. If a plan works, you get the credit. If a plan fails, it's someone else's fault, right? Which is exactly what happened with Adam and Eve also. So what is Abram's fault here? Well, he's got a lot of them. He stupidly accepted his wife's advice, but I don't think that's what she's thinking, that was the problem. He got Hagar pregnant, but that was the goal, so it's not really a fault. Apparently the fault is that Sarai did not expect Hagar to become insolent. It must be Abram's fault. He must have led her on. He must have let her think that now she's in charge and that I won't love Sarah anymore. Oh, I love you, dear. You're cuter. So it's really just jealousy. She's jealous, and jealousy is always blamed on the spouse. Sarai insists that Abram impregnate Hagar, but now it's Abram's fault that Hagar is not staying underfoot. And in her anger, Sarai even invokes this as a wrong that God must judge between us. God judge between you and me for this outrage. You believe that? It's amazing. This is a serious, wicked tantrum from Sarai. She demands that God judge Abram for doing what she begged him to do. Now, she's half right. Abram stupidly accepted Sarah's scheme. But really, if God was going to judge them, there's probably an equal share of blame here. Abram should have taken lordship over the plan and vetoed it rather than doing her idea. But even now, Abram refuses to take responsibility, and he just lets Sarai do what she wants. His wicked reply is, "Hagar is your maid. You can do whatever you want with your maid. I wash my hands of it." That is the same answer that Pontius Pilate gave to the wicked Jews. It's not my problem, not my responsibility. You're a slave, you deal with it. The fact is that Sarai is under Abram's authority. And everyone and everything under Sarai's authority is still Abram's and God's. A righteous steward can never abandon the responsibility that God has given him, especially now that Hagar is pregnant with his child. The baby in her womb is Abram's child, and yet Abram tells Sarah she can do whatever she wants. That is wicked. Now you might say, well, Abram assumes that Sarah is a righteous person, and so she'll do what's right. But that's not a good assumption in this case. Sarai is scheming and angry and casting blame and spitting nails and demanding that God judge. And you're going to tell her to go do whatever she wants? That's not a good idea. And that's hardly an exhortation to be careful and measured and godly in your actions. It sounds more like Abram just wants his angry wife out of his face. He's just dodging responsibility. She's mad, let her go do whatever she wants. I don't care. So given Abram's permission to do whatever she wants, what does Sarai do? Our translation says that Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar. Well, that is what you would call a minimalist reading. The most common translation of this verb is to oppress or afflict or torture. It's the same word used in Exodus of the Egyptians oppressing the Jews. So it's not nice. She was mean. Sarah decided that the best way to get Hagar back in line was by demanding, yelling, beating, and perhaps worse things. This was not just a little tiff between women. It was an authority figure doing everything in her power to ruin the life of a younger slave woman. That is evil upon evil. And Abram apparently didn't lift a finger to stop it. Now, it's not clear whether Sarah and Abram even cared about the unborn child. What if it dies in the womb? Are they just going to say, oh, I guess that wasn't God's plan? It got so bad that Hagar ran away. Now, we'll look more at Hagar and that situation next week. But turn over now to Proverbs chapter 30. We're going to look at 3 verses in Proverbs chapter 30. It's the next to the last chapter in Proverbs. 4 things the world hates. Proverbs 30, verses 21 to 23. For 3 things the earth is perturbed, yes, for 4 it cannot bear up. For a servant when he reigns, a fool when he is filled with food, a hateful woman when she is married, and a maidservant who succeeds her mistress. I want you to notice that 2 of the 4 really big problems here are about women, and 2 of the really big problems here are about servants. Now, what that might tell you is something we have known since the Garden of Eden. No, there are no servants in Eden, but there were disagreements about authority. So turn now over to Genesis 3:16. Genesis 3:16 is what Jesus said to Eve regarding some of the consequences coming on Eve for her sin and for drawing Adam into that sin. You could call it the curse on the woman. It's not exactly a curse. It's more just explaining what you've done and what it's going to do to you. Genesis 3:16. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. The implication is that Eve will not like being under Adam's authority. She didn't like it before either. Women fallen in sin like Eve, which is every woman ever born, just like every man ever born, they prefer to rule themselves. But that's not enough. It'd be great if you could rule yourself, right? Ruling yourself, though, is not enough. Eve and these other ladies in the future will want to rule your husbands and your children. If only women ran the world, everything would be great. Men are so dense and simple and childish. The fact that God says that the men should rule is of no bearing in the eyes of unbelievers. Now, we have no time and I have no interest in going into every detail of sexism and feminism and all of that stuff. But the biblical truth is that in a marriage and in a family, the man is supposed to be the boss. Now, that does not mean he cannot leave many aspects of life to the wife because she's competent and trustworthy to do those things. But when it comes to big and important decisions, the man is supposed to decide. Eve didn't like that. Sarah didn't like that. It's too bad. The problems were caused when women force or manipulate or trick the husbands into doing things their way are huge. The problems even then, like Sarah did, the woman even then blames the man for doing what she demanded. Now, Abram has tons of blame here, but Sarah is plainly wicked also. Sarai schemes a sin, convinces her husband to do the sin, blames the husband for the sin, and then railroads Abram out of the tent with a free ticket to do any harm she wishes to the mother of his own child. That is evil upon evil upon evil. And her evil does not stop even when there might be a danger to the child. Women are no less capable of evil, anger, torture, selfishness, or any other sin than men are. Being more clever, or better at manipulating others is not always a virtue. It means you're capable of greater sins, because once you convince your husband to sin, then you're responsible for his sins as well as your own, at least in part. There's also a great danger in acting upon your emotions. Obviously, men have emotions too, and men act on their emotions to their own detriment. But it is certainly worth mentioning that women have a reputation for acting on their emotions too quickly and too deeply. Sarai became vengeful and cruel very quickly, enough to cause a slave to run away in fear for her life. When anybody, person, man or woman, gets so angry that they're threatening harm or death on another, they are wicked. The only exception would be is in a break-in, if you're protecting your family, if you become enraged and fight back, of course that's a good thing. But that's not what we're talking about here. In this scenario, Sarai has a plotted, planned revenge. And her husband was either too scared or too uncaring to do anything about it and allowed it to happen. Do you imagine that living in a tent with Sarai and Hagar, Abram didn't see or hear everything that was going on? Of course he heard and saw it. Even if he sat outside under the cool oaks of Mamre, he would hear it. Abram is failing as a husband and a father and a slave owner. He's failing in every realm of authority to protect people under his authority. If your wife is abusing someone, the husband has to stop it. If your kids are abusing someone, the father has to stop it. If your employees are abusing someone, the boss has to stop it. The verses we read in Proverbs speak of 4 big evils in the world, and all of them seem to be based on authority and its disruption. You see, lack of authority is the basis for chaos. Chaos is one of the greatest loves of the devil and one of the greatest hates of God. Chaos is lack of order based on lack of authority. Chaos is what happens when sin is unchallenged because authorities will not intervene. Chaos is what we have in our society because crime is not considered to be punishable. Chaos is what we have because men do not act as fathers and because mothers kick out their men because they want to rule themselves. Chaos is the lack of blessing in your life based partly because you reject the word of God as the authority in your life. Chaos is the state of your mind because you waste your day away watching television and playing with phones, so there is no order or outline to your life. Chaos is what Satan wants for you personally, for your family, for your church, for your city, and for your country. Chaos has consequences, and chaos keeps people away from God. Men not doing their jobs as husbands permit chaos in their families. Women trying to manipulate their husbands bring chaos into their families. Children not obeying their parents are intentionally challenging authority to see if they can get chaos because they'd rather live without rules and order. Every aspect of life, from school to family to church, is filled with demons or your own selfish flesh, thinking that chaos means freedom. Wouldn't you like to be free? Wouldn't it be great not to have any rules? Freedom in our evil society means the ability to choose any evil and do whatever you want. That is satanic freedom. That is chaos freedom. True freedom is living under authority, starting with God himself, and then under your father or your husband, and then the church, and then the government. So satanic freedom is chaos. Godly freedom is living under authority. So that's all I have for today on Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. Are there any questions or comments about that?
So when they wanted children, I would think they were hoping for a boy.
Yes, of course, they want a boy.
Mm-hmm. They got a girl.
Then it would not be the heir. I guess they would just let, I'm assuming they would probably let Hagar keep it.
Yeah.
Because a girl doesn't really do them any good. I guess they could marry her off and make an alliance of some sort. But
or try again for another boy.
Yes, I'm sure they would keep trying. Well, I don't know whether Sarah would keep trying after the first pregnancy. Probably not. At least not with that one. Maybe she'd find another cute girl. Any other questions? All right, we'll stop there and we'll have our worship service a little bit later.